What's the worst Batman comic ever? For me, it has to be The Dark Knight Strikes Again. But when I said that last year, many people kept saying it was actually All-Star Batman and Robin, The Boy Wonder. And oh boy do I wonder, why is it hated so much? I mean, it's only the origin story of Robin. How bad could it be? Turns out, it was really bad. Just take a look at the quote that DC Comics used to promote this new version of the origin of Robin. This one's going to have a lot of babes in it. Oh boy do I wonder. Now, to be fair, the last time I read the story before doing this video was more than 10 years ago, and all I really remembered were, in fact, the babes, and also the memes. I needed to go back to the story to see if those were actually the only two memorable things about it, and to understand why this is the other most hated Batman comic. Now, in order to do that, we first need to understand how exactly this thing came together. In 2005, DC Comics started making some big changes, introducing first a brand new logo for the company, and later announcing a new series of comics. But all of these were not isolated changes, and to explain that better, I've asked my good friend Owen to give us a glimpse of just what was happening in the comic book industry at the time.
The early 2000s was a turbulent period for the comic book industry. As DC and Marvel grappled with the collapse of the speculator bubble at the end of the 1990s and the latter's filing for bankruptcy, they both embarked on new ways to reinvigorate their publishing line. For Marvel, this came in the form of the Ultimate Universe, a brand new series of books that reimagined characters like Spider-Man and the X-Men in a brand new modern continuity. Now, these comics proved to be hugely successful and spawned an entire imprint's worth of monthly comics, limited series, and events. Unsurprisingly, this caught the attention of DC, who in 2005 attempted a similar yet different endeavour known as the All-Star Initiative. Whilst Ultimate Marvel was an interconnected universe, meaning that the version of Peter Parker seen in Ultimate Spider-Man would cross over with the universe's other characters, DC's endeavour was a place for special out-of-continuity stories featuring top-tier creative teams. The two launch books for this new imprint were All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely, and All-Star Batman and Robin by Frank Miller and Jim Lee. Before I hand the video back to Salazar to talk about what All-Star Batman actually is, I wanted to add an interesting historical note. Originally, Jeff Loeb was hired to actually write the series, following his and Jim Lee's recent collaboration on Hush, before the writer exited due to him signing an exclusive contract with Marvel. In a 2009 interview with Wizard magazine, Loeb opens up about his departure from All-Star Batman, stating that, "I was supposed to do All-Star Batman and Robin with Jim Lee, but I left for Marvel and DC wasn't too keen on me continuing, even though Marvel was okay with it. But hey, they got Frank Miller in the end. I know that Jim and I will go back to Batman one day. Hush 2 is still in the cards. What nobody knows is that Art Adams was going to do the second All-Star Batman and Robin arc, and I started that as well. Full script, issue 11. Crazy, huh? And Arthur drew half of the book, outrageously beautiful stuff featuring Man-Bat, but it'll never see the light of day." With Loeb out, DC instead turned to one of the greatest Batman writers of all time, Frank Miller. Surely the man behind such acclaimed stories as Year One and The Dark Knight Returns could pen a tale fitting of the All-Star label, right?
Looking back at All-Star Batman and Robin, it's honestly quite shocking that it's hated so much, considering the art is so amazing that it's impossible to hate. I had honestly forgotten how beautiful these covers are, right from the very first one. But as much as I love them, I have to admit that these covers don't really illustrate anything about what happens in the first chapter. In order to get all of the psychological damage possible from the story, we have to look at the variant covers by Frank Miller, which are the complete opposite of the Jim Lee covers. This first variant cover is ugly and grotesque, which is a perfect description of the first chapter, even though the opening pages are gorgeous with the beautiful art of Jim Lee showcasing a bright and optimistic Dick Grayson performing at a circus with his parents. There is something very strange about it, and it's the captions. The internal monologue of Dick Grayson where he talks about what he's doing and we watch him do exactly what he's saying. It's flat storytelling, but beyond that, it's also weird, because the way he repeats the same phrases over and over and over is just not natural. What is Frank Miller really saying here? Is he just out of his mind repeating words and phrases like a madman? Well, maybe. Or maybe not, because what he's doing here is reinforcing, in a very excessive way, how Dick Grayson feels about his parents. He keeps saying how they are always there to catch him, which represents the safety that they mean in his life. And Miller reinforces these at the start because by the end of the chapter, he will absolutely destroy this safety. Dick Grayson's parents are killed in front of him, and when the police take the boy away from the circus, Dick's internal monologue changes slightly. Now, instead of his parents, it's the police who catch him, and they represent anything but safety. It's a really clever idea, but the problem is that in order to get it, I had to read this issue a couple of times, taking notes to understand the thought process and separate this one good idea from all the other nonsense. And believe me, there's a lot of nonsense. It all starts when the story hits us with the sexiest illustration of Vicki Vale ever created, without any warning or context whatsoever. And it's not just one page, it's almost 5 full pages of Vicki Vale walking around in nothing but her pink lingerie. This sequence is not really a story as much as it is a fashion catalog, and now we get what Miller meant when he said there was going to be a lot of babes in this. Frank Miller was just horny, and he really wanted us to focus on the sex appeal of Vicki Vale, giving us unnecessary images of her body and writing intentionally suggestive dialogue. He really hammers down those ideas like a madman with a blunt instrument, except his instrument is the art of Jim Lee, which is sharper than it has ever been, cutting deep into our minds with some of the most gorgeous visuals he has ever created. Now, Vicki's role in the story is to go on a date with Bruce Wayne, and so they give us a whole sequence of Vicki trying out multiple outfits and makeup, while repeating the same phrase over and over and over. After Dick Grayson, Vicki Vale is the second character that does this, and now it becomes clear what the story is really about. The retelling of the origin story is really just the concept, because the execution is all about Frank Miller experimenting and pushing the limit of how absurd and excessive a comic he could make. Now I want you to remember these 2 words, because they literally define the whole story. Frank Miller was not interested in making a good or interesting story, he just wanted to make it as absurd and excessive as possible, and that also means breaking Batman, which is exactly what Miller does as soon as Bruce Wayne appears, making him reveal to Vicki Vale that he has been keeping an eye on the young circus acrobat Dick Grayson, as if that's not creepy at all. Even worse is how in Bruce's internal monologue, he calls the boy a brat. Like, what did this innocent boy that you don't even know ever do to you, you maniac? And that was only the start, because then Miller breaks the origin of Robin, making the Flying Graysons kinda pointless. The whole reason Dick's parents are always circus acrobats is because they die while performing, but here they are shot, just like the Waynes, so what's the point of them being acrobats? The only answer is because Batman needed a young acrobat to avoid having to physically train him, when he decides to turn the boy into a literal soldier, which happened sooner than Batman expected, now that the boy is an orphan. Batman, however, has no problem taking the boy and dragging him into his world, a world of obsession, vengeance and violence from which there is no way out, or at least that's what Batman tells the boy when he literally kidnaps him. Needless to say, this Batman is a psychopath. He uses snake poison on his batarangs to seriously damage the shooter, and he also repeats the same phrases over and over and over. But oddly enough, that's the only thing that kind of makes sense. It doesn't really work with other characters like Dick and Vicki, because it makes them look stupid or something. But this Batman is so unhinged that it makes sense that he repeats stuff like a lunatic. Come to think of it, this whole story feels like it was written by this Batman, because only someone that crazy could come up with something this bizarre. If this was a normal story, Batman would immediately start working to find out who killed the Graysons, and the plot would focus on the actual origin of Robin. However, this is anything but a normal story, and the origin of Robin takes a backseat to make room for some of the most insane batshit moments ever printed in a Batman comic. The excess and absurdity of the storyline increases exponentially in the second chapter, where Batman doubles down on the kidnapping of a 12-year-old boy that he tries to drug while calling himself the goddamn Batman. Then he slaps the kid to stop him from crying and kills at least a dozen cops with a Batmobile that transforms into a Batplane full of deadly weapons. And all of that while laughing like a maniac. Now this is the real Batman who laughs. The second chapter also follows these themes of excess and absurdity, but right at the very end, this madman shows some signs of humanity and decency. It's a very short-lived moment, but there's a small glimpse of the logical, grounded Batman, somewhere underneath the thick layers of insanity of this Batman who laughs. Now, with 2 chapters into the story, I realize that it's impossible to take it seriously, because it seems like it's trying really hard to do some sort of black comedy, but unfortunately it's not too funny. It's just disturbing. Like, take a look at the variant cover of Chapter 2 by Frank Miller, featuring a Robin cowering in fear under Batman's shadow, and splattered in blood. DC Comics basically signed up Frank Miller so that he could torture Dick Grayson and destroy Batman. All of this insanity feels like Frank Miller giving the middle finger to Bill Finger, the man who basically defined Batman and Robin as the dynamic duo that we know and love. Everything about this story is insulting to the legacy of the characters and to the reader's intelligence, and the worst part is that it's intentional. By the end of the second chapter, it seems like there will be some progress about Robin's origin, but as I said before, that's just never meant to be, as the third chapter focuses mostly on Black Canary, because Frank didn't promise us a good story, he only promised us a lot of babes, and by God he delivers. More than half of Chapter 3 showcases a blazingly hot Black Canary, working as a bartender and dealing with thugs that act as if they were in a strip club. And once again, Miller's themes are consistent, with lines of dialogue that are repeated endlessly to the point of absurdity, and an excessive amount of splash pages and panels showing a sexually loaded Black Canary in every possible angle and pose to enhance her fantastic body. These are 13 pages of excessive and absurd storytelling, all of which is completely and totally irrelevant to the origin of Robin. The only thing that happens here in regards to Robin is that Batman keeps talking down to the boy, as they are still going on their way to the Batcave. It's been so long that the clean shave that Bruce had at the circus has now become a full stubble. Hell, it's been so long that Dick's photo is now all over boxes of milk, and there are printed headlines of his kidnapping, which of course makes Superman super pissed off. Now, none of this makes any sense because it feels pointless and it's super frustrating, but only if you're reading this seriously, and that's the problem. This is not a serious story. Miller is consistent in keeping things utterly absurd, like turning the Batmobile into a Batplane and now into a Bat submarine, and of course it's all done in big, excessive splash pages just for the sake of it. Oh, but as far as excessive splash pages goes, we have to stand in awe of the 6-page splash centerfold in Chapter 4, showcasing the Batcave in all of its glory. I really wonder if this is the largest splash page ever printed in a comic book. I wouldn't be surprised if it actually is. Now, the great thing about this moment is that after 4 chapters, Batman and Dick have finally arrived at the Batcave, but that's really the only good thing about it, because it quickly devolves into more absurdity, more insanity, with a Batman that gets mad because Dick is not impressed with his cave. This Batman is a literal man-child who goes around naming everything after himself, like the Batmobile and the Batcave, which is something that normally the kid Dick Grayson does when he becomes Robin. But here Miller flips the concept on its head, and now it is Dick who is the more mature and sensible, while Batman is an overgrown brat who gets weird about the death of his parents, recalling himself touching his dying mother's bleeding breast. And as if that wasn't uncomfortable enough, Batman then abandons the recently orphaned, traumatized and starving 12-year-old boy in the dark and cold cave, telling him that food will present itself, essentially suggesting the boy to eat rats. In the meantime, Madman goes to do some detective work, and in this story that means brutalizing more cops to interrogate them about the killer of the Graysons, the same killer that Madman poisoned in Chapter 1. And then he goes back to the cave, where he goes on a blind rage against Alfred, because the butler had the decency of feeding Dick Grayson, giving him a burger that honestly looks delicious, and actually, it did present itself to the boy. However, that is not what Madman had in mind. He wanted Dick Grayson to suffer and go through the same pain as he did, which is the complete opposite of what Batman normally wants for Dick Grayson. Normally, he wants to guide and protect the boy from becoming like him. Frank Miller is basically doing Batman and Robin but backwards, and at this point the only question I have is, why? What's the point of making the most absurd and excessive Batman comic? What is Miller trying to prove here? That no matter how bad he makes a comic, people will still buy it? Or did he just want to show how much he hates Dick Grayson? How much he hates the fantasy of Batman and Robin? A writer like that should never be allowed to write Robin. But here we are, in the most awful moment of the story, where all the terrible things keep piling up on top of each other until not even the great art of Jim Lee can make it work anymore. So I guess it's a good thing that Chapter 5 came out literally 1 year later, giving Jim Lee a long break to deliver some of the best Batman art of his career, which was utterly wasted in yet another horrendous chapter, where Frank Miller gets off showing us what he really thinks of the DC Universe, showcasing Metropolis as an ugly and depressive place, while the members of the Justice League are all horrible beings and not heroic at all. They all have to hide from society in dark places to argue between them, and try to agree on how to deal with Batman, as if they were criminals plotting a murder. Frank Miller has always been a controversial creator because his work is usually transgressive, but this time around this transgression reads as actual hate and contempt for the DC Universe, and that's awful. As I keep reading and watching the madman who laughs gleefully destroying and brutalizing a couple of thugs, all I can think of is Frank Miller gleefully laughing as he writes this insane travesty of a story that doesn't make any sense at all. Like in Chapter 6 when he introduces Barbara Gordon as Batgirl, and in her bedroom she keeps poster of the Adam West Batman as well as the Dark Knight Returns, which as I said doesn't make any sense at all, because neither of those versions of Batman can exist in this universe. Now, the point of having these posters is to show how Barbara is obsessed with Batman and explain why she becomes Batgirl, but all of this just shows that Frank Miller only knows how to write one kind of female character in the Batman mythos. In The Dark Knight Returns, Carrie Kelly was inspired by Batman to become Robin. In The Dark Knight Strikes Again, the Super Chicks are inspired by Batman to join the revolution. Now both Batgirl and Black Canary are, you guessed it, inspired by Batman to put on a mask. So basically Frank Miller's female characters in the Batman mythos are all the same character with different masks. But that's not the worst part about the writing of Chapter 6. The worst part is how everyone starts calling Batman as the goddamn Batman, without any logical reason in the story itself. It's almost as if Miller listened to the frustrated reaction about him calling Batman that, and instead of correcting or changing anything, he tripled down to the point where every character calls him that, which is excessive and absurd. And that's the whole point. And speaking of frustrating things, every time Miller remembers this is supposed to be an origin story of Robin, he makes some small progress with it, making Batman go after the killer in a brutal and excessive way. But then he immediately gets sidetracked with hot babes. This time it's Black Canary, finally making a second appearance and revealing that the whole purpose of her character in the story was just to bang Batman. I kid you not. In Chapter 7, Black Canary gets in trouble with some thugs and distracts Batman from what he was doing in order to save her. Batman then proceeds to beat the thugs. But remember, this needs to be excessive, so naturally the madman who laughs uses a Molotov cocktail, burning every one of the thugs alive as he continues to brutalize them. And because this needs to be absurd as well, Black Canary gets all wet, and not because of the rain, but because she just witnessed the goddamn Batman in action, and what follows is Miller's absurd take on a cozy and romantic sexual encounter in front of a fireplace, as Batman and Black Canary get it on in front of the burning thugs right then and there in their rainy docks. And that's all Black Canary was really good for, because after this event, both Batman and Miller had no more use for her, and so she's out of the picture, for the most part. Which is for once a good thing, because now finally we make some real progress with the origin of Robin, as Batman returns to the Batcave taking the killer with him, so that Dick Grayson can have closure. But what follows is not remotely inspiring or heroic whatsoever. Dick Grayson has spent all this time alone in the cave, and it seems he's started to become just as violent, irrational and unhinged as his new mentor, which is exactly what Batman wanted. Dick has now picked up an axe that he uses to kill a rat, and then cut the killer's mouth open in order to interrogate him using the madman's methods of violence. Dick has now even adopted the nasty attitude of Batman, all of which shows that Dick Grayson has lost his childhood innocence, and there is no one to blame but Batman. However, the story doesn't want to go there yet. And instead of showing Batman as the one responsible for breaking this kid, it brings forward the one Batman villain that needs to be in every important Batman story. Chapter 8 introduces the Joker, and here I noticed something interesting. In the same way that Frank Miller inverted the roles of Batman and Robin, making Batman childish and Dick Grayson more rounded and mature, he does the exact same thing with Batman and the Joker. Because this clown prince of crime is anything but insane or deranged. This is a tormented Joker, a freak that is almost depressive, with a permanent frown in his face and always brooding, always moving in the shadows and behind the scenes, orchestrating some sort of master plan. What I'm saying is that this Joker is more like Batman, while Batman is more like the Joker, an insane lunatic that laughs like a maniac as he goes around Gotham committing crimes. However, despite how serious this Joker is, he is still a cold-blooded killer, working with an insane henchwoman that is not Harley Quinn. It's just this crazy Nazi chick from The Dark Knight Returns that Frank Miller brings back. But still, I can't shake that feeling that this version of Joker is more like Batman, especially when he goes to meet with Catwoman, and on top of a weird sexual tension between them, she calls him Joker Man, almost as if she was calling out Batman. At first, I wasn't sure this idea of switching the roles of Batman and Joker was intentional, but then I noticed that the variant cover of Chapter 8 features an illustration by the legendary Batman artist Neal Adams, and it's a picture created as an optical illusion where the images of Batman and Joker blend together as one, reinforcing this theory and showing just how much better Chapter 8 is compared to the entire madness that has been this story so far. Because besides the whole Joker angle, that actually makes sense, the relationship between Batman and Dick Grayson also starts to show some signs of improvement, as Batman starts going easy on the kid and encourages him to find a mask if he wants to join him as a crime fighter. And this is perhaps the smartest moment in the entire storyline, because we see the inspiration that leads Dick Grayson to adopt a heroic identity. Just like Batman, he had an emotional connection with an old movie hero, only in his case it's Robin Hood, inspiring Dick to become an archer, and to be perfectly honest, I absolutely love that idea, because it works perfectly. Robin Hood was the actual inspiration for the creation of Robin, but besides the name and the colors of his outfit, he was nothing remotely similar to the legendary archer. This was the first time ever that Robin actually had the chance to honor the main source of his inspiration and become an archer, which I think is also more logical for a 12-year-old boy, because it makes much more sense that he uses a bow and arrow, attacking enemies from a distance and keeping himself away from danger during battles, providing better assistance for Batman rather than being a liability. And it wasn't even a controversial or new idea, because Frank Miller already did that with Carrie Kelly when her main weapon as Robin was a slingshot. It just makes a lot more sense having Robin as a ranged fighter who attacks from a safe distance than having a kid brawling against adults twice their size. I would honestly love to read a story where Dick Grayson becomes an archer, at least in his early years as Robin, until he could actually join Batman in fights. And I would love that, because despite how much they tease that idea in this story, going as far as giving Dick his own outfit and calling him Hood, it never comes to happen because Batman simply doesn't like it, and instead he decides how the kid should call himself and fight. And although I think that's a lot of wasted potential, I also see the problems of changing the entire history of Robin. In the end, I think there's a message here about how the fate of small kids is always in the hands of their parent. Now, the only other thing that happens in Chapter 8 is that Green Lantern goes to Gotham and taunts Batman with a big lantern signal. Green Lantern wants to talk to Batman, but because Batman is a control freak, he sets up another meeting in another time and another place, which takes us to Chapter 9, the most important chapter of the entire storyline. And I say that because this chapter marks a radical change in the tone of the storytelling. It doesn't happen at the start, because as soon as this chapter begins, we are taken into one of the most absurd and excessive moments ever created in the history of Batman. It's almost exactly as one of those ridiculous and bizarre Silver Age stories, with a Batman that paints a whole room, Robin and himself entirely yellow. And all because Green Lantern's weakness is yellow. This is a moment that on a surface level is beyond stupid, but when you stop for a second and look at it closer, it's kind of brilliant. Because what Miller is showing us here is Dick Grayson's first actual appearance as Robin, and how does he do it? he presents us with a little imp that has become the mirror image of Batman, both visually and symbolically. Batman and Robin now share the same colors, the same goals, and they act together as one. Robin is like a little extension of Batman, always assisting the Yellow Knight against their common foe, and Robin goes as far as fighting Green Lantern by himself, using the same brutality and violence he learned from Batman. The same violence that almost gets Green Lantern killed and becomes the turning point of the story, as Batman finally sees what he has created, what he has brought upon himself. Batman almost made a killer out of an innocent boy, so he has to face the fact that he messed up and now he needs to save Green Lantern, revealing his true identity to both Green Lantern and Robin for the first time ever. This is a massive change because now that Robin knows the man behind the mask, Batman finally realizes everything he has done wrong and takes Dick Grayson to the cemetery, where they both can properly grieve and mourn the death of their parent in the most sensible, honest, and poignant moment of the entire storyline. And for that same reason, this moment stands out among everything else in the story, because it is completely out of place among the utter insanity that has been this whole project. For most of the story, All-Star Batman and Robin was an outrageous experiment on absurdity and excess, with a complete lack of restraint when it came to violence and sex, and an absolute disregard for characterization, feelings, or psychology. That's what makes this moment so special, so different. And to understand this radical change, it's important to remember the publication schedule of this project, which was a nightmare, with months of delay between each chapter and in one case a whole year. So when chapter 9 came out in 2008, a lot of things were different from when the story started back in 2005. And perhaps the most important difference was Frank Miller himself. I don't know what happened to the man, but when you look up images of Frank in 2005 and compare them with images of 2008, there is a big difference. In 2005, he seemed more happy and not taking himself too seriously, but in 2008 he had become somber, much more serious than before, a change that is reflected in the story. Now he's doing a serious Batman story, and besides whatever happened to him around that time, I'm convinced that he was listening to the critical reaction. He was aware of how people felt about the story, and that reaction made him reconsider the whole approach to the story, because at the end of the day, All-Star Batman and Robin was anything but a good reading experience for anyone.
All-Star Batman and Robin is a comic that I have a lot of conflicting feelings on. When I covered it on my channel several years ago, my overall takeaway was that this was mostly a series of confusion and missed opportunities. To give All-Star some praise and credit, I think Jim Lee's artwork throughout is stellar. It's honestly one of his best looking comics, and for all of the frequent delays between issues, you can really tell that every tiny detail on every single page was handled with such care and focus. While the book is undoubtedly great to look at though, its writing and handling of characters is odd to say the least. I'm still not quite sure if this story is intended to be satire, with Miller parodying the overtly dark caricature of Batman that spawned in reaction to stories like The Dark Knight Returns, or a writer now much older than during his heyday with the character, struggling to make sense of what he actually wants to say. Miller's Batman always had an edge to him, but in All-Star it's taken to such extremes that Bruce feels like a genuine psychopath. Although this could be by design, with the idea that Dick Grayson's arrival humanizes Bruce, an idea explored really well years later in Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen's Robin and Batman, the execution here doesn't go far enough for me to confidently say that this was intentional. Instead, all we're left with is a truly bizarre story, full of a Batman that swears, kills, forces orphans to eat rats, and goes to the length of painting himself, Robin, and an entire house yellow just to beat up Green Lantern, and somehow speaks volumes while saying shockingly little. It's a sad turn of events given Miller's legacy on Batman, Jim Lee's incredible artwork, and the company it's shared in the All-Star imprint, with Morrison and Quitely's All-Star Superman being regarded as one of the best DC comics ever. All-Star Batman and Robin is a curious case with a deeply intriguing and weird history behind it, and I think it's why this story has garnered such a legacy for better or for worse. Even for all of its faults, it's still a book that every comic book fan knows about and will be remembered for years to come. We'll never forget the goddamn Batman.
Almost 3 years after it began, Frank Miller realized that in his efforts of making the most absurd and excessive Batman story, he had painted himself like a clown, and in Chapter 9 he decided to come clean and let the tears of Batman and Robin wash away the yellow paint from his own image. I really think that Frank Miller put a bit of himself in this Batman, and to me that becomes evident in this chapter, when a remorseful Batman shows regret for all the mistakes he did, for traumatizing a young boy. And I can picture Frank Miller going through the same regret and remorse after all the mistakes he did in this series that traumatized a lot of Batman fans. And it feels so real to me that the moment in the story where Batman's internal monologue is asking, begging for a second chance, feels like Frank Miller talking directly to us, to the readers. And that's an even bigger tragedy than the last page of this chapter. Chapter 9 is unironically great, because it reflects the storyline as a whole, going from the most absurd Batman moments ever to some of the most serious and dramatic ones, with Frank Miller finally bringing back his A-game, only for DC Comics to cancel the series in the next chapter. There has been a lot of speculation about why this happened, with the two main theories about it being that it was cancelled because of low sales and that the creators were just too busy and not interested anymore. But the truth might be a little different, because in many interviews both Frank Miller and Jim Lee confirmed that the story had at least 5 more chapters and that they were planning to relaunch the series under a new title called Dark Knight Boy Wonder. So if it wasn't the creators, then it had to be the sales, right? Well, not exactly. So, using the sales data from Comicron, I made this super amazing chart, and as you can see, the blue bars represent the sales figures of each chapter. Naturally, the first issue sold very well, with over 250,000 copies sold, but the sales of each following chapter were clearly declining until they flatlined, with the last 3 issues selling less than 100,000 copies each. So it would seem that sales were indeed not doing great, but the red line tells a different story. Now, this one shows the ranking in the top 10 sales of every month each chapter came out, and as you can see, the series never fell below the top 10 best-selling comics of each month. The first 4 chapters remained solid in the first 3 spots, but the series fell all the way to the 9th spot with chapters 5, 6 and 8, because people clearly started to lose interest. Chapter 7, however, recovered all the way to the 6th spot, because of course people wanted to see Batman banging Black Canary. And then the final chapter makes a great comeback, claiming the spot number 4, but that's mostly because of the controversy about the profanity that was printed in that chapter, which was not properly censored, making people want to get a copy of this rare issue more because of the printing error than the story itself. So as you can see, it wasn't necessarily low sales either, because all things considered, the story sold relatively well. The real reason why it was cancelled is rather simple. By 2008, DC Comics was making big changes to the Batman comics, which resulted in the cancellation of iconic series such as Robin, Birds of Prey, The Batman Strikes, Catwoman and Nightwing. So it seems that All-Star Batman and Robin simply joined this list of cancelled Batman comics in the late 2000s. Which is really unfortunate, because true to Frank Miller's new approach, Chapter 10 is substantially different and better than the majority of the storyline. He completely abandons the idea of making things absurd and excessive, and starts making a grounded Batman story, more focused, less insane, less chaotic, and more restrained. Even though Batman is still a bit rough around the edges, he's also more level-headed and mature, as he stops acting like a madman, and this change is reflected in the art, as it seems Jim Lee is having a blast finally illustrating a traditional dynamic duo in action, delivering some of the best pages of the story. And what really makes this chapter better is that now there's a driving mystery that gives the story momentum and makes it interesting. This is what All-Star Batman and Robin should have been from the start, to the point that I actually wish this was the first chapter of the story and not the last one. It would have been so good to start off in this dark and mysterious Gotham, following the very first adventure of Batman and Robin as a team solving the mystery of who attacked Catwoman. In the story, it is implied that it was the Joker, so the mystery could have also been connected to the origin of Robin, which could have been told through flashbacks of the key moment, removing all the other nonsense that ruined the story. Because the nonsense is the main problem, even in the final chapter. There are just a lot of characters and a lot of plot lines that simply never go anywhere. Vicky Vale, the Justice League, Black Canary, Batgirl, all of them are meaningless to the main story. The entire storyline is 195 pages long, and only 90 pages of those are dedicated to the origin of Robin. That is less than half of the story dedicated to the main plot, showing just how unfocused and meandering the writing was. In chapter 10, all we get are 5 pages of Batman and Robin, while the rest of the chapter is focused on pointless scenes with Batgirl, Black Canary, and James Gordon, who suddenly becomes the main character of the final chapter. Something that I find funny, because what Miller is doing here is just going back to do the things that worked for him in the past. Just like in year 1, Miller once again turns this into a Commissioner Gordon story, focusing back on his problems like he did back in 1986. Not only that, Miller also recycles the moment when Joker assaulted Selina Kyle from The Dark Knight Returns, and repeats the exact same thing in this final chapter. And if that's how the story was going to develop, then I think it's better that it was cancelled and it was left unfinished. Because it seems that Frank Miller had run out of good ideas, and the only thing he had left was to repeat himself. And that's the worst thing that could happen to one of the most influential Batman creators. In a very strange way, DC Comics deciding to cancel the series is actually the best way to end it. This outcome is the most clear evidence that this is a story that should have never happened in the first place. The previous Batman story by Frank Miller was an absolute disaster, which should have prevented Miller from touching Batman ever again. But Miller had all the right contacts at DC Comics, being very good friends with the current Batman editor, who didn't really care about the quality of the stories, and DC's publisher being a Miller fanboy that hated Dick Grayson. So of course he was given another shot and total freedom to do whatever the hell he wanted. The only difference is that instead of doing his own horrible art like in DK2, Miller was paired with one of the best comic book artists, which just goes to show that no matter how great the art is, the comic is gonna suck if the story is ass. Now, this sequence of events, with Miller creating a bizarre story about an old Batman by himself, and then working on the origin story of Robin with a talented artist, is just like what happened in the 1980s, when he first created a bizarre story about an old Batman, mostly by himself, and then worked on the origin story of the character with a talented artist. It's like history repeating itself, but with completely different outcomes. While his work in the 1980s was a groundbreaking critical and commercial success, his work in the 2000s was one awful disaster after another, and that's why I think it's better that All-Star Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder, remains incomplete and unfinished. Because it also marks the end of one of the darkest and most awful chapters in the history of Batman. By the late 2000s, DC Comics had replaced all the people responsible for allowing these and many other awful Batman stories to be created, and All-Star Batman and Robin became the final chapter of this awful era that absolutely doesn't need to be brought back at all. Finally, I want to give a massive thanks to Owen for his contributions to this video. Not only was he generous enough to help me out with some of the historical context, but he also made one of the best videos about All-Star Batman and Robin, which was a great resource for this video, and it has many more behind-the-scenes details about the story, so make sure to check it out. And as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and a special thanks to Thomas Murray, Wallscaler Batman, John Papp, Caronade, Marco Daniel, Kay, Agent Meister, Gaetano Barreca, and Ace Mowick. Thank you all so much for your support, and I will see you in the next one.